Well, first of all, I'd like to thank very much the organizers. I think we had a great morning of presentations, and I'm really excited, not only for being here, but also for what is to come. So I'm going to talk, my talk is related to the last one before lunch. So teams or collaborations. I mean, we do scientists like to collaborate. We try most of the time to avoid this thing that we are seeing here and try to get something productive. Now, Carol already talked about teams a little bit in the introduction. So for the first 5 minutes, just like it might look like a little bit of like a repetition, but I mean, just bear with me. And after that, I will give you something new. So I guess that a lot of, even though like there is a long body of research on teams, a lot of the hype started in 2005, 2007, where there appeared papers in like high impact journals showing that the science had been increasingly being produced by teams in the recent decades. And not only that, but also the research that was produced by teams was having a larger impact than that produced by solo authors. The thing is that even though, publishing in teams is in principle good in terms of impact, not all the teams are equally as good, right? So the first paper on this in 2005 showed that the composition of teams in terms of experience of the members in the teams matters. So a combination between incumbents and newcomers to the team is probably the one that works best. Then there is a large body of research saying that diversity in terms of background, gender, ethnicity translates in a higher team effectivity or productivity or impact. But sometimes large teams cannot be, are not really maybe like the best option. So in this very recent paper by some people here in the audience, they show that small teams might be better positioned to create disruptive science than larger teams are. So, working in teams is good, but not all teams are equally good. Also, there are other difficulties to working in teams, right? So communication is like the typical example of what is complicated. So there are communication costs. There are typically language barriers when you have interdisciplinary teams. There are coordination costs added to the coordination cost of a team if you belong to multiple institutions and so on and so forth. And yet, despite all these difficulties, people decide to work in teams. So they want to engage in collaborations with universities that are high up in the scale of universities, let's say. And they do that most of the time, probably, well, most of the time they do that. All right. The data suggests that people want to engage in collaborations with higher, like with top universities, because that results in larger impact for your papers. Other studies show that, the larger the number of countries involved in a paper, typically the larger the impact is going to be of the paper. So, there is a cost, but there is a benefit, so you pick what's your, balance between both. Now, the question that we wanted to ask, ourselves was, what are the factors that affect how we collaborate from a scientific point of view? And in particular, we were interested in trying to find, among all these factors, how gender affects the way scientists collaborate. So do female academics collaborate more or less or differently than men? Which is something that Carol touched upon earlier. I'm not going to talk about homophily in here, so this is going to be a complement to what she presented. And if I have time, I will also talk about how other factors such as like resources or funding affect the way we engage in scientific collaborations. So the first one, so our question about gender. So there is, a fair amount of evidence claiming that having females in your team, it's beneficial. It's beneficial because it's increasing like the capacity of the team to perform a task, or what is being called the collective intelligence factor of the team. It's beneficial because in general, women tend to be more collaborative. So they engage more in their personal contact and they help the team like function better. However, what happens in science that in order for you to be able to collaborate with a woman, you need to have them there in the first place. And as we all know, there is this issue in science into which like there is this leaking effect. So from, say, in here what I'm showing, like the lines are data from NSF, the orange bars are data that we collected. So this is the percentage of degrees awarded to females. The green is the bachelor degree. The blue is the master's degree. And the purple is the PhD level. And the orange one shows the faculty level. So as you see in cases like biology or psychology, there is quite a difference between, there's quite a gap between the fraction of female faculties and the fraction of females that got a PhD, right? Which is an issue, right? It's an issue when you get your data because you know you're going to have very few females. Well, but in any case, you can collect this data. So, and what we did was we decided to look at the collaboration patterns of women who are successful. And not every woman in any publication, but only the women who were actually faculty and who got to decide with whom they wanted to collaborate. So what was our expectation? So, well, I know that maybe social psychologists in the room, which probably there are many, know more about this than I do. But the thing is that different studies, or like meta-studies from leadership science, show that there are these small but consistent differences in the leadership styles between men and women. So men tend to be more autocratic, task-oriented, agentic, and transactional. So their way of leadership is they make a contract with the team member, like I will do this, you will do that, and this is our goal. Instead, female leaders tend to be more democratic, interpersonal, communal, meaning like more nurturing or trying to care for the people in the team, and transformational. So the way they try to be more empowering in order to have people in the team transform themselves or like in order to reach their goals. So, okay. Now, the thing is, if female leaders are more empowering and more collaborative, what does this tell us about the way they are going to collaborate in a scientific environment? How does it translate? So this is something that we will try to answer. So, well, this was our goal, try to understand how funding and gender affect like scientific practices. And to that end, we collected a lot of data. So this was a long time ago. We started doing it in 2007. So this was previous to OrgID, Research ID, or anything like this. So we had to go, this was a very tedious process. We had to go we went to the faculty web pages of like top universities in the US in different disciplines, and we could see by the picture if it was a male or a female, and then we developed like some search from in like the Web of Science so that we could get all their publications. We had to disambiguate the name, so it was long, but we managed to do it. So we got data for 6 different departments, roughly 800 women and a little bit over 3,000 men. And we wanted to analyze this data, right? So this I already showed you, so this is just like illustrative of what are the fractions of females that we found in this faculty and in these different departments. And this shows that, you know, there is way more males than females, and you see that there's the percent of current faculty, and the x-axis is the career length in years. And as you see, like the red proportion of the bar, which is the fraction of females, doesn't increase in recent years. So in our data set, we could not see an increase in the number of females that were being hired. But we collected the data between 2007 and 2009, so that was 10 years ago, but well, that would add like a few bars, and I'm not sure things have changed that much. And the first thing that we wanted, and I'm going to digress and then come later to the collaboration thing, but I think that this is of particular importance. We were interested in knowing how resources could affect the productivity of females, okay, of female academics. So, and this was sort of motivated by this like MIT faculty newsletter in 1999 when they made a survey, and they discovered that female faculty were not only earning less, but they also had significantly less lab space than their male counterparts. I mean, I'm not sure if you can read it, but the president at the time said like, well, I thought that gender differences were part reality and part perception, and I'm shocked to see that reality is the far greater part of the problem. And I don't know, I mean, it's like MIT data is not public, so nobody knows if they reach equality. But data from the American Association of University Professors, what I'm showing here, shows that there is still gender inequity because you see that these bars are not placed at the center of the distribution. So we can make the assumption that resources are still not equally distributed. And so our idea when we look, well, our expectation, and that's what we found, right, is that because resources are not equally distributed, and then we expect to see difference in productivity when we look at female academics with respect to that of male academics. And we see that that is true. So this is some, I'm just showing plots of some like normalized productivity. The blue line corresponds to males, the red lines to females, and you see that there is a gap between both, which means that that males are more productive than females because the line is lying on top. If you plot this average discrepancy with respect to the resources needed, which is data that we took from NSF, you see that there is a negative correlation, right? So women who are in more resource-intensive fields produce less papers than men. I'm not going to show the data, but we also saw that women who are in this, who decide to go into these like resource-intensive fields actually are much better and have higher impact than that of men, but that will be for another day. So, okay, going back to collaborations, so as I said before, so female leaders are more empowering, are more collaborative in principle, right? Or that's what the studies say. And we wonder, so what does this mean? What should we observe? Should we observe that women have more co-authors? Should we observe that women collaborate in larger teams? I mean, what are we going to find out? So let's see. So the first thing that we see is that women seem to have less collaborators. There's a distinct number of co-authors, but because the number of collaborators increases with the number of publications that you have, if you control by the fact that women tend to have less publications, then they are indistinguishable. They have a number of collaborators that is equal to that of men, right? So what I'm showing you here in the plot is like this, what's called the survival curve. So this is the probability that a person in the sample has a number of distinct co-authors that is larger than what you see in the x-axis. So the blue line is for males, the red line is for females, and the gray area corresponds to the randomized population of males equivalent to females in terms of publications. So as you see, no difference because the red falls inside the gray. What we see is that women typically repeat fewer co-authors than men. So in a way, they have the same number of distinct co-authors, but they don't repeat them as often. Okay? So, well, there is that difference. For some reason, women do it differently. Now, if we control for career stage, meaning the time since your first publication, then we don't see that there are like really sustained differences across fields when we look at the size of the teams, right? We only see differences in two different places. So what I'm showing here is the probability of males having a greater number of co-authors, and we see that most of the red, right, which is our measures, falls within like the random expectation, which is the gray here. But we see that in molecular biology, at the sort of like 10 to 20 years after the since publication and early stages in chemistry, they do look different. So we got really interested in finding out why women they seem to look like systematically a different number of co-authors in the field of molecular biology when they are like sort of like, 15 years after their first paper, 20, like so already in some sort of associate professor position or something like this. And what we find, and this is something that was kind of very commented within the biology community, is that within the molecular biology field, women segregate by field. So what I'm showing here is the average number of co-authors versus the fraction of publications by females, and each one of these dots corresponds to a journal, okay? So we find that journals that typically, no, it's not a journal, it's an area, sorry. It's an area in the Web of Science. And we find that those, no, it's a journal in here. No, I showed the plot for the journal. Yes, the journal. And so what we find is that women decide to work in areas in which the average number of co-authors or the average number of size of the teams is smaller. So you remember the other plot that I showed you, in which I showed that women get less productive the more resources they need. So the last dot in there was molecular biology. So there you have it. They get less resources, right? They publish less, and they decide to publish in areas in which the teams are smaller, probably because there are less resources needed to maintain a smaller team or a collaboration that is not so big. So, well, there are not that many differences, but in some fields, right, especially in those that resource intensive, women decide, to opt to go to fields in which the size of the teams is more controlled. As a matter of fact, and this is not really a curiosity, but it's really something that shocked us. One of the big dots in here, like the purple one, those are, and those ones to the very left of the plot, they belong to like genetics, genomics. So this field is really like an outlier in our case. We looked in our database and we found that out of the 10 top scholars for that field, none of them was a female. And which is very unlikely, because given that roughly 25% or 26% of our data were in that field were females, then you would expect to have at least 2, right? More or less in there, and we find none. And this correlates very well. So this is sort of like, there seems to appear this vicious cycle in which big labs are dominated by males and they basically hire male postdocs, and these things like perpetuate. And this is, if you want to read the paper in PNAS by Fetzer and Smith, they do a very good analysis of the proportions and how this happened. And actually, like leading PIs in molecular biology who are female actually also tend to hire only female postdocs. So there seems to be this homophily both ways. So, well, up to here, I just talked about gender differences. Now, this very last thing that I'm going to talk about, it's about how funding affects the way we perform science. So we just saw that when we look at gender differences, funding is an issue. But then here we wanted to see how different funding or scientific structures affect the way we collaborate, right? So we know that funding definitely affects the topics on which we work. Unfortunately or fortunately, we don't know, but you do science policy and you decide what are the best areas in which you want to invest your money. Now, it has also an effect in the way we are going to perform science, especially if funding is going to big center initiatives that have teams from different disciplines that have to collaborate, so on and so forth. So this is going to probably have an effect on the way we are going to team up with other people. Actually, I found this blog from one of the deputies in NIH, where he did an analysis of the last 10 years or so of how the team size had increased in NIH-funded grants, not surprisingly, because they have these big, UR grants that involve lots of people, and the teams has increased, impact has increased, and they are very happy about it. Okay, good. So now, we wanted to see what was the effect of funding. So what we decided was to compare the patterns of collaboration between US and European scientists. So there are different schemes of funding. Well, I have 5 minutes, so I think I have time. So they have, I don't know if you're familiar, but some of you are, some of you aren't. So in Europe, typically countries have their own individual funding system, but the big money very often comes from the EU, from the European Union. And they have different schemes. They have the H2020, they have the ERC, which is more like individual grants. The largest part of the budget is in this sort of H2020 framework in which grants are collaborative. So all grants have to have at least 3 PIs from 3 different countries, right? So that forces you to collaborate with people from other places. In the US, usually grants not that I know of have people team up with people from different states by mandate. So you can do whatever you want. But you have, so there are different agencies, foundations that, can award grants to individual people. right? And in the same way, like the way science is structured is different. So in the US, labs grow around individual PIs, whereas in Europe, there is sort of this hierarchical structure in which there are this hierarchical structure of scientists, right? So typically groups of PIs, of faculty, grow around like a full professor or a deputy of research or something similar in research centers. And things have been changing slowly, but this sort of hierarchical class structure puts a lot of constraints on the way like people like ask for projects and perform science. So what did we do to understand how these different funding structures affect the way we collaborate? So we went and we took the top scientists working in a certain field, right? And we analyzed the way they were collaborating. So our expectation is that, taking into account the funding and the scientific structure constraints, scientists that are affiliated in an EU country are going to be collaborating more with other scientists affiliated in an EU country than US scientists are going to do in terms of collaborating with other US-based scientists. But let's see what happens, right? So I'm showing data only for one of the cases that we looked at, and this is, we are just finishing the work, but I think there's nicer results. So unfortunately, you cannot see the names clearly, but this is network science, because being a network scientist myself, this is the first one that I tried. So it doesn't matter the way we collect the top 100 scientists, the results are pretty robust. So in here, circles belong to US-based scientists, and triangles, which look like a little smaller, they are EU-based scientists. And the colors show the different groups that we found. And in order to find the groups, we use what's called a stochastic block model. I'm not going to give details if somebody wants to know about it. But the idea is that this kind of model will identify different roles in the network. Roles, different groups that play different roles in the network. And these groups don't necessarily have to be tightly connected. They could just be grouped because they connect to the same things, right? So they are just roles in the network. And what we see, and maybe it's not obvious from here, is that the groups that we find, and this is something that is true across all the disciplines that we looked at, they are very polarized. So really meaning polarized in the sense that the content, right? So the fraction, here I'm plotting the fraction of, the average fraction of the same content is scientists in the same group. The blue line is what we measured, and the yellow bars is the expectation if we reshuffle the labels of the affiliations and we keep the same groups, okay? So clearly, it's something that it's super polarized. And we did some hierarchical modeling. It's polarized throughout all the levels of the hierarchy. So really, like US and EU scientists do have different roles in this network of collaborations between like top performing scientists. Now, if we look a little bit deeper, okay, so they have different roles, but what do they imply? So the thing that we see, and here I'm showing the normalized connections within each group with continents, with scientists in the same continent. So the red bars correspond to US scientists and the blue ones to EU-based scientists. And we see that the blue is a little bit shifted to the right. In fact, but it's more telling. You see the first pin, like the height of the red bar is much higher than the blue one. So it's not only that they play different roles, it's that EU scientists collaborate more with other EU-based scientists than US scientists do. And this is not because EU scientists simply collaborate with more people. Because when we plot the number of distinct collaborators with respect to the number of publications, and I'm sorry, dots are very small, but the blue dots are EU-based scientists, the orange dots are US-based scientists, and you see that there is, we run lots of statistical tests, and there is no differences between, there are no statistical differences between the two populations, so they do have the same number of co-authors. The problem is that EU scientists collaborate more with other EU-based scientists in the same field, whether US scientists, they do not. They do not establish the network of collaborations within the same field. They just look elsewhere, or not with other scientists working on the same in the same country. Okay. So these things, and I'm done. Just like one more second. So what does this tell me? Like now, the implications of this can be big or not, but the thing that this tells us, right, is that If it's true that repeating collaborations is not good for creativity, right? Because you're always thinking in the same way. If it's good for a team to be very diverse in order to be more productive or to be more creative or innovative, then having a scientific, like a funding structure that makes you collaborate with every time the same person is not good. Also, if all the top scientists are always collaborating between themselves, this makes it very hard for people who are just starting to become one of the club. So, well, it has all sorts of implications that I will not be able to show you today, but maybe next time. And well, just the last one. This involved a lot of people at Northwestern, Luis Amaral, Han, Teresa, at Indiana University, Filippo at my home university, Jordi, Roger, and Lluís, and at the University of Toronto, Carlos Montaner, who worked on the very last piece. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yep. Thank you for the great talk. So I would like to know what you think about gender quotas in academia. What are your thoughts on them?
If I think there should be, or
yeah, what are your thoughts? So whether they are useful, whether it's or even if you think they are not useful, whether we should have them. So what's your thinking about those?
Okay. So there are many women who think that there should not be quotas because they should earn their position. But I don't think I quite agree with that, because what I found from the data set is that in many fields, women actually perform better than the average of men. So then why can't we have, and I say this in quotation marks, more mediocre scientists who are female? Like, meaning mediocre, nobody's mediocre, but I'm saying people who perform just as the average or below average, because certainly if there is an average, there are people who perform above and below, right? So maybe we do need to cover the whole spectrum, right? Why the only women who do super well get the right to become a faculty member? This is something that I don't agree with. And in that sense, I do agree with the fact that there are quotas, why not? I mean, at least until the situation levels out, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, welcome.
If I understood the argument that women are maybe less productive as faculty because they get fewer resources in forms of startup packages, lab space, et cetera, were the controls done, or has anyone looked that within just males or within just females, there's a wide range of startup packages and lab space. So if you look in just the male population, those who get less, are they less productive?
I wish I could answer the question. I don't have the data.
Yeah, so I must be very hard to guess.
So I mean, I guess that from what we see, it should be true, right? That it's hard. I mean, so I guess the argument is simple, right? You get less money, you can hire fewer people, and there are less man hours to do the work.
The deductive consequences of that argument is that effect ought to persist everywhere, right, regardless of gender, and could then explain the disparity.
Yes, it's true. No, definitely true. But we don't, as I said, unfortunately, we don't have data for that. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe, if we talk with some department, they would give us the data on the starting packages, but I don't think they are going to.
I think it could be arranged if the faculty were anonymized.
Okay.
Cool. I may be delusional in that prediction.
I think you might. I mean, no.
I have learned earlier today that the difference between delusion and innovation is subtle.
It's subtle.
Maybe we should talk.
Okay, thank you.
So as someone from the United Kingdom, I'm not sure if I count as European still.
Well, until
Although,
2 weeks from now, maybe.
Yeah, at least until the 30th. So I've been a victim and beneficiary of the Horizon 2020 system. And I wondered if, as well as looking at the diversity that comes from working across disciplines, at least in my field in clinical medicine, there's a great diversity within disciplines in different countries. So if you try and put together a clinical trial designed by a German and a Dutchman and an Englishwoman, there's blood on the carpet because of the differences in the ways that people can set. So are you able to within the European countries, split them, if you could, into the more fiery Mediterranean and the more austere British Anglo-Saxon type, and see whether those different approaches to the way science is done are actually in play?
So what's the question? Sorry, I mean, I'm just not sure.
So the question is that as I took it, your argument was that in Europe there's collaboration within disciplines across countries. In the States there's collaboration across disciplines, and that one's preferable to the other. What I'm saying is that establishment within discipline across European countries can also be very diverse, but you could categorize them into groups of countries with shared common features, because one might argue that Swedes and Dutch people and British had more in common than Italians and Greeks and Spanish people if one was trying to characterize people.
I guess it's true. It depends on the field a little bit. I guess what it's getting to at is that maybe the first time that these three clinical medicine researchers collaborate, it's going to be, hard because of the different ways. But by the second project they asked together, they already know. Sort of thing. Maybe you don't think it's true, but I mean, it's certainly a good point. I mean, in the discipline, I didn't look at clinical medicine, so I mean, if I do, I will come back at you and ask you about it. But I mean, in terms of what we looked at, we couldn't see any difference in sort of like geographical country composition within the EU, if that's what you're getting. And it was sort of like uniformly distributed, even though, so, you pick disciplines that you know somebody who's familiar with them or that you're familiar with them, and you can see the groups, and they are more related to topics rather than geographical region. So they are more like these people, I don't know, network science. So these people work in like multi-layer networks, or these people work in like epidemics, or these people work in, right? These were more kind of like the features that you could see in the groups based on this.
Yeah, thank you. So I hope it's okay, I'm asking another question. I had also wanted to ask about your explanation of the gender productivity gap. I thought Jim's suggestion was a really good one because there are some alternative explanations of that gap out there in different literatures. So for example, Carol has pointed out you might see a productivity gap like that if, because of gender socialization or expectations of bias, women are putting more work into each project. So expecting I have to get it to a higher level before I submit if I expect it to be accepted. And so there might be other things that would cause that. And so some kind of data that would show like, in fact, these packages are different, or, women who get larger packages are more productive might be something really interesting to look at, actually.
Yeah, the thing is, the first thing that you mentioned about waiting for, the problem with me is that I'm not saying it's speculative, but it's hard to measure. So how am I going to plot one thing against the other? So I'm a very pragmatic person in that sense. But it's true. That if I could measure that, it would be great to do it. So yeah, I would have to read about more about this to know. But the thing is that we couldn't find, even though if we looked at the literature, we couldn't find like a quantitative metric that I could plot my data against.
I agree that would be extremely difficult to measure. It would be really difficult to show that was in fact correct. But then other things that solidify this supposition that it's because of differences in funding packages might, sort of help bolster your claim. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I agree. This is just a suggestion. It's not like I'm saying that this is the case. There is just like, so it looks like it. But yeah, the other data would be more convincing. Yeah. Thanks. I think.
Looks. I wonder if you could give us a little bit more details about the research that you alluded to, which suggested that the women faculty were actually more effective or talented.
Well, no, I mean, the studies in social psychology were not done on teams of scientists. They were done on teams of people performing tasks. So it's a little bit different, the setup. I mean, of course, in our case, it's past data, right? I cannot run an experiment of a team of people, writing a paper. I mean, I wish I could, but I can't. So those were like very controlled, sort of task-oriented, people divided into groups, and they were looking at the behavior as a team, right? So this was, teams of different sizes, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, And they could see that the fact of having more females in your group was making the communication within the team better, and they were better able at performing the task, right? But this was not in a scientific environment. They had to perform a task, which is some sort of analogy, but it's not really a scientific task, right?
I see.
Because it's more open-ended. So that was our expectation, but from one to the other, there is some sort of big jump, I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so.
All right. Well, thank you very much then.